On a brutal 49°C morning, Michael Turner faced something no one would believe. A desperate mother raccoon knocking on his door, begging to save her 3 freezing cubs. Torn between fear and compassion, he opened the door, and what followed was a night of trust, mischief, and a bond so moving it would change him forever. Michael Turner had lived through harsh winters before, but nothing like this morning in Duluth, Minnesota. The moment he opened his eyes, the silence of his small cabin felt heavier than usual, like the world outside had been swallowed whole by ice. He pushed himself out of bed, the old floorboards creaking under his weight, and shuffled to the window. What he saw made his chest tighten. The thermometer nailed to the porch railing had dropped lower than he'd ever seen, minus 49 degrees. Even for northern Minnesota, that number didn't belong in reality. It was the kind of cold that could turn life brittle in an instant. He rubbed his hands together, blowing hot breath into his palms as he reached for the kettle. Coffee was the first defense against mornings like these. As it hissed and bubbled on the stove, he turned the radio on low, hoping for some weather update that would reassure him this was only temporary. Instead, the announcer's voice crackled with warnings, calling it the most dangerous cold spell in decades. People were told not to go outside unless absolutely necessary, to stay close to heat, to guard themselves against the air itself. Michael let out a humorless laugh. "Stay inside," he muttered to himself. As if anyone could survive out there long enough to do otherwise. He poured the steaming coffee into his chipped mug and walked toward the window, drawn to the eerie stillness outside. The wind didn't just howl, it whipped columns of snow into the air, twisting them into ghostly shapes that danced across his yard. The trees stood like frozen skeletons, their branches glazed in ice so thick they looked ready to shatter. For a long moment, he simply stared, the steam from his mug fogging the glass, the only warmth between him and the frozen storm beyond. Then, something shifted. At first, he thought it was a trick of his tired eyes. A dark blur against the white backdrop, low to the ground, moving unevenly. He set his mug on the table with a clatter, leaning closer. His heart gave a startled thump. Right there, against the frost-coated glass of his porch door, was the hunched figure of a raccoon. Her fur, once thick and grey, was stiff with frost. She trembled violently, each breath puffing in small clouds that smeared across the window. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, 3 smaller shapes clung together in a pathetic bundle, their tiny bodies shivering uncontrollably. Their fur was crusted with snow, their noses buried in one another, as if the closeness might ward off the cold. Michael blinked, gripping the windowsill, stunned. He'd seen raccoons plenty of times, usually sneaking into garbage cans or trotting across alleys under the cover of night. But never like this, never desperate, never so exposed. Then the smallest cub stumbled, its weak legs giving out. It collapsed into the snow, body twitching, so still that Michael's breath caught in his throat. The mother raccoon reacted instantly. With a jerking, almost frantic motion, she picked the cub up by the scruff of its neck and pressed its tiny body against the glass, right where Michael stood. Her golden eyes locked onto his through the frost, and for a second, he forgot to breathe. Those eyes didn't look wild, or feral, or cunning the way raccoons usually did. They looked pleading. She tapped the glass once with her paw. A soft click that echoed louder than the storm outside. Then again, tap, tap, like a knock at the door. Michael's chest tightened. His instincts shouted that wild animals weren't meant to be invited inside. They carried disease. They could scratch or bite. But standing there, staring into the raccoon's trembling face as her cubs sagged limply in her jaws, he felt his logic start to crumble. The wind howled and rattled the windows, reminding him that time was running short. The coffee on the table cooled, forgotten. Michael could almost feel the cold creeping in through the cracks, could imagine what that merciless air was doing to those tiny bodies outside. He pressed his hand against the glass, the warmth of his palm fogging over the spot where the mother raccoon leaned close. Her eyes widened, as though she understood the smallest gesture of kindness. Michael swallowed hard. In all his years as a firefighter, he'd faced flames that threatened to devour homes, smoke so thick it blinded him, and moments where his choices decided who lived and who didn't. He thought he'd left all of that behind. But standing here now, looking at this desperate mother and her shivering young, he realized he was being tested again. Not by fire this time, but by ice. Outside, the cub in her mouth whimpered, so faintly he almost didn't hear it. She tapped once more, claws clicking gently like a soft knock, and Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't ready to make the decision yet, but deep down, he already knew. The storm screamed around his house, rattling every window pane. And on the other side of the door, a family of raccoons waited for him to choose whether they lived or died. Michael stood frozen in place, staring at the frosted window where the raccoon mother pressed her muzzle close. Her breath fogged the glass in quick bursts, each one growing weaker as the seconds passed. The cub in her jaws gave another feeble twitch, and the two siblings behind her stumbled forward, their tiny bodies quivering like brittle leaves in the wind. For the briefest moment, he thought this had to be a hallucination, a trick of the storm. But the soft tap of her paw against the glass told him otherwise. It was as real as the ache in his chest. His instincts screamed that this wasn't right. Wild animals didn't act like this. They scavenged, they hissed, they kept their distance from people unless cornered. But this mother had walked straight through the storm, across the frozen yard, and now stood here, begging him for help. That single act made the world tilt sideways. Michael pressed his hand against the glass again, and she tilted her head, as though searching for a sign. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, stepping back from the door. He ran a hand across his face, trying to steady his nerves. Years of training as a firefighter had made him cautious, disciplined, unwilling to risk anyone's safety for reckless impulse. Yet the image of that tiny cub collapsing replayed in his mind, over and over. He could almost hear the silence that would follow if he didn't act, the silence of a life snuffed out in the snow. The phone rang suddenly, jolting him. He grabbed it off the counter, still watching the animals through the glass. "Michael?" It was Sarah, his neighbor from across the narrow road, her voice sharp with concern. "You all right in there? I saw movement by your porch. What is it?" He hesitated, unsure how to even explain what he was seeing. "It's raccoons, Sarah. A mother and her babies. They're at my door." "Raccoons?" she barked. "Oh, for heaven's sake, don't you let them in. Those things can bite. They carry God knows what. Don't you dare open that door." Michael clenched the phone tighter. "One of the babies is barely alive. The mother's—" He stopped, realizing how absurd it sounded. "She's asking me to help." Sarah gave a harsh laugh. "Animals don't ask for help. They're wild." "If you open that door, you'll regret it." But even as Sarah warned him, his eyes never left the scene outside. The mother raccoon shifted, lowering her cub gently to the step. She nudged its tiny body closer with her nose, then looked back up at him, eyes wide, trembling but steady in their plea. Tap, tap. Her paw struck the glass again, so soft yet so insistent it made Michael's heart race. "Sarah," he said quietly. "I think she knows." "Knows what?" "That I can help." Her sigh carried through the receiver like static. "Michael Turner, you've always had a soft spot for lost causes. But this is madness. You're not running a rescue center. Let nature be." But he couldn't. The storm roared outside, making the walls creak, making the old cabin groan like it might split in half. Out there, everything was hostile. And yet, against that merciless backdrop, stood a mother raccoon who had trusted a man instead of the wilderness. That trust alone demanded something from him. Michael set the phone down without another word. He stepped toward the door, his hand hovering over the latch. His pulse thudded in his ears. Memories of fire rescues flickered back. The moment he had to decide whether to run into a burning home, whether to believe the risk was worth it. This felt no different. He cracked the door just an inch. The cold slammed into him like a fist, burning his face, searing his lungs with every breath. The mother raccoon stiffened, clutching her cub close. Michael crouched low, making himself smaller, less threatening. "It's all right," he whispered, though his voice was shaky. "I'm not going to hurt you." She hesitated, her eyes darting from him to the tiny body in her mouth. Then, with deliberate care, she set the cub down on the threshold. Snowflakes clung to its fur, its chest rising so faintly Michael had to lean forward to see it at all. He reached out with trembling hands, scooping the little creature up. It was like holding a piece of ice. The cub's paws dangled limp, its whiskers frosted stiff. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was too late. Behind him, the two siblings squeaked weakly, their sounds nearly drowned by the wind. The mother raccoon stepped back, her body hunched, ears flattened, but her eyes locked on him, waiting. Not threatening, not lunging, just waiting. Michael pulled the cub against his chest, letting his body heat seep into it. He stepped back inside, pushing the door closed with his foot. The warmth of the cabin enveloped him, but he felt no relief. Not yet. He turned, staring at the fragile life in his hands, willing it to breathe stronger. Then he heard it. Another tap at the glass. He spun back around. The mother raccoon was still there, the two cubs pressed against her sides. She tapped again, her claws clicking like a steady knock. Her gaze shifted from him to the cubs, then back, as if to say, "You took one. Now take the rest." Michael's throat tightened. Logic screamed again. 3 wild animals and their mother inside his cabin. It was insanity. But when the smallest cub in his arms let out the faintest squeak, curling weakly against his shirt, he knew the decision had already been made. The storm howled louder, rattling the windows and shaking the door in its frame. And on the other side, a mother raccoon waited for his answer. Her trust laid bare in the middle of a world cold enough to kill. Michael closed the door against the storm, his arms wrapped around the limp little raccoon. Its fur was icy, its breath faint, and for a moment, he thought he might be holding a life already slipping away. He set it gently on an old wool blanket near the fireplace, rubbing its tiny body with the edge of the fabric, the way he remembered paramedics rubbing frostbitten hands. The cub gave the smallest twitch, a sound that was half squeak, half sigh. Relief washed through him, but it was short-lived. He knew there were still 2 more outside in the brutal cold. The tapping on the glass came again, steady, rhythmic. Michael turned and found the mother raccoon's eyes locked on him. The other 2 cubs huddled against her chest. She didn't move, didn't snarl, didn't bare her teeth. She only waited. Every instinct he'd ever had about wild animals told him this was wrong. Raccoons weren't supposed to wait patiently at doors like neighbors asking to borrow sugar. They were supposed to scatter when spotted, melt into shadows. Yet here she was, showing him a kind of desperate patience. The phone on the counter buzzed again, and against his better judgment, Michael picked it up. Sarah's voice cut sharp and fast. "Michael, did you listen to me? I saw you open that door. Don't be a fool. You can't let them inside. That's not safe for you. Not safe for anybody." Michael looked back at the tiny cub on the blanket. Its sides rose and fell in weak but steady rhythm now. He lowered his voice. "Sarah, one of them nearly froze to death. I couldn't just shut the door." "You're out of your mind," Sarah snapped. "They're wild, Michael. They don't thank you for kindness. They bite. They scratch. They spread disease. Please, just put them back out. Don't drag trouble into your house." Her words echoed what his rational mind kept saying, but his heart wouldn't let him agree. He imagined putting the cub back outside, its fragile body stiffening in the wind, its mother's desperate eyes watching him close the door. That picture alone made him sick to his stomach. He stepped closer to the window, phone still pressed to his ear. The mother raccoon tapped once more, softer this time, her paw leaving tiny wet marks on the glass. The two cubs clung to her, their cries faint but clear through the storm's roar. "Sarah," Michael said quietly, "I've run into burning houses without thinking twice. I can't stand here and let these babies die. Not when their mother came to me. She could have hidden them in a hollow tree or dug a den, but she brought them here, to me." Silence stretched for a moment before Sarah answered, her tone shifting from scolding to weary. "Michael, you always did believe you could save everything, even the things the rest of us would walk away from." He ended the call, placing the phone back on the counter. He didn't want to hear her protests anymore. This decision was his to carry. Drawing a long breath, he cracked the door again. The storm clawed at him instantly, icy air slicing across his skin. The mother raccoon froze, watching him with wide eyes. Michael crouched low, reaching out a hand. "Bring them," he murmured. For a moment she hesitated. Then, with surprising gentleness, she nudged one cub forward. It waddled unsteadily across the porch and tumbled into Michael's hand. He scooped it up quickly, holding it close to his coat. The little body trembled, but it was alive. He backed into the warmth of the cabin, setting the cub beside its sibling near the fire. The mother shifted again, glancing at her last cub, then at him. The storm howled, blowing snow across her fur until she looked more like a sculpture of ice than a living creature. Slowly, carefully, she pushed the final cub toward him. Michael extended his arms, and this time the cub climbed clumsily into his hands, as if it understood what was happening. The mother raccoon's gaze never wavered. He carried the third cub inside, laying it on the blanket beside the others. 3 tiny bodies, now pressed together, whimpering softly as the heat of the fire reached them. When Michael looked back at the door, the mother raccoon still stood on the porch. Snow whipped around her, clinging to her whiskers and eyelashes. She didn't step forward. She only stared at him, as though waiting for permission. Michael's breath caught. The weight of the choice pressed down on him. Letting her in meant opening his home, not just to helpless babies, but to a fully grown wild animal, one with teeth and claws and instincts he couldn't predict. He could hear Sarah's warning in the back of his mind, sharp and insistent. But he could also hear something else. The silence of the cubs before he had taken them in, the silence that had sounded like surrender. He stepped aside from the door, holding it open wider. "Come in," he whispered. The mother raccoon hesitated, lifting her nose to the air that poured through the threshold. Then, with a cautious grace, she shook the snow from her fur and crossed into the cabin. The warmth hit her, and for a second she simply stood there, scanning the space, her tail twitching in quick bursts. Finally, she padded over to the blanket, nosing each cub as though to reassure herself they were safe. Michael shut the door behind her, leaning his back against it as the storm rattled the wood. He realized he was trembling nearly as much as the animals had been. The cabin fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the faint squeaks of the cubs and the steady crackle of the fire. Michael had done it, against reason, against warnings, against fear. He had let a wild family into his home. And deep down, though his heart still pounded, he knew there was no turning back. Michael leaned against the door he had just closed, his breath unsteady, his palms damp despite the freezing air that still lingered around his boots. The storm outside hammered against the cabin, snow whipping past the windows like shards of glass. But inside the little house, something else entirely was happening. A wild raccoon mother had crossed his threshold, and her 3 cubs, fragile, half-frozen bundles, were huddled on his old wool blanket by the fireplace. The crackle of flames and the soft squeaks of the babies filled the silence, blending into a strange and tender music. The mother raccoon didn't rush or panic as he had half expected. Instead, she stepped cautiously across the wooden floor, her claws clicking faintly, her nose twitching at the strange sense of man and home. She moved straight to her cubs, lowering her head to sniff and lick each one in turn, pressing her body around them like a living shield. Her actions carried none of the frantic edge of panic. They were deliberate, maternal, filled with the urgency of love. Michael crouched nearby, keeping his movements slow. He felt like an intruder in his own house, as if this moment didn't belong to him at all. Still, he couldn't take his eyes off them. He had seen courage before, in burning buildings and disaster scenes. But this was different. This was the quiet, unyielding courage of a mother refusing to let her young die. Then came the first ripple of mischief. One of the cubs, though still shivering, raised its head and sniffed the air. Its tiny paws reached out, brushing against the fringe of Michael's old rug. With an awkward stumble, it rolled over and let out a squeaky chirp that almost sounded like a laugh. The sight startled Michael into a chuckle he hadn't felt rise in months. The mother raccoon glanced at him sharply, amber eyes narrowing. But instead of bristling, she turned back to her cub, giving it a brisk lick on the head, as though to say, "Settle down." Michael shook his head slowly. "You're something else," he whispered. Just then, a sharp rap rattled the front window. He jumped, his pulse spiking, but it wasn't the storm. Through the frost, he saw Sarah, bundled in her thick coat and scarf, peering inside with wide eyes. She must have braved the short walk across the road, unwilling to leave him alone with what she clearly thought was madness. He opened the door only a crack, enough for her voice to slice through. "Michael Turner, have you completely lost your mind? They're inside." "You let them in." Her voice carried alarm, but also something more, an incredulity born of seeing with her own eyes what she had dismissed as his soft-hearted imagination. Michael raised a hand, urging her to lower her voice. "Keep it down. You'll scare them." "Scare them?" she hissed. "They're raccoons. You should be scared of them." "Come here," he said, motioning her inside. "Just look." Reluctantly, Sarah stepped in, snow clinging to her boots. She froze when she saw the scene by the fire. The cubs, now pressed against their mother, blinked up with wide, glassy eyes. One let out a tiny chirp and batted at its sibling's ear before tumbling sideways, landing in the folds of the blanket. The mother raccoon didn't lunge or bare her teeth. She simply kept one cautious eye on Sarah, the other on her brood. Sarah's hand drifted to her mouth. "Good Lord," she whispered. They're just babies." Her words trailed off into the crackling firelight. For a long moment, both neighbors stood in silence, watching the unlikely scene. Michael felt something swell in his chest, an odd pride, as though he'd been entrusted with a secret no one else could understand. The cub that had tumbled sideways found its way upright again, and with a squeaky determination, it waddled toward Michael. He froze as the tiny creature pawed at his boot, sniffing, then tugging gently at his shoelace. With surprising persistence, the cub pulled until the knot gave way, and the lace spilled loose. Michael laughed out loud this time, the sound rough but full of warmth. Sarah's brows lifted, a reluctant smile tugging at her lips. "Well, I'll be... cheeky little thing, isn't it?" The mother raccoon gave a low chuff, not of anger, but of warning, and the cub scampered back to her side, still squeaking as if proud of its conquest. Michael leaned back on his heels, shaking his head. They don't even seem afraid. Like they know they're safe here. Sarah crossed her arms, though her eyes never left the family. Safe for now. But Michael, what happens when the storm ends? You can't keep them here. Folks in town would have a fit if they knew. He didn't answer right away. He knew she was right. But the thought of putting them back into the blizzard tonight, it was unthinkable. He would deal with tomorrow. Tonight, they needed warmth, food, and safety. As if reading his mind, the mother raccoon lifted her head and looked directly at him. Her gaze was steady, her body still, but there was something in her eyes that stopped him cold. It wasn't wild hunger or fear. It was something he almost recognized. Trust. Sarah must have seen it too, because her voice softened. "She's thanking you," she murmured. Michael swallowed hard, the knot in his throat thickening. He had thought himself prepared for whatever winter threw his way, but he hadn't been ready for this, for a wild creature to step through his door, bringing with her both chaos and grace. The storm battered the cabin walls, the fire snapped and hissed, and inside, man and raccoons shared a fragile peace. Michael knew it was only the beginning. He had opened his door to something wild, something unpredictable. Yet in that moment, watching the cubs squirm and tumble against their mother, he felt no regret, only a strange, unexpected warmth that the cold outside could never touch. The storm outside raged without pause, hammering the cabin walls as though trying to shake them down. Snow piled higher against the windows, dimming what little daylight managed to pierce the clouds. But inside Michael's small home, another world had come alive. The fire snapped and hissed in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the unlikely guests stretched across his worn blanket. The 3 raccoon cubs, though weak from the cold, stirred with restless energy as the heat seeped back into their tiny bodies. Their fur, once stiff with frost, began to soften, steam rising faintly from the melting ice. The mother raccoon curled herself around them, grooming each one with brisk, rhythmic licks. Her rough tongue rasped over their ears and bellies, coaxing them into comfort. The scene should have been wild, alien, but instead, it felt astonishingly natural, as if his living room had been waiting all along for this small, struggling family. Michael crouched nearby, elbows on his knees, unable to look away. He'd spent years fighting fires, pulling strangers out of wreckage, always moving, always bracing for disaster. But here, in the steady glow of the firelight, he felt something entirely new. Stillness. The danger outside was beyond his control, yet here he could offer warmth and life in the simplest of ways, just by opening his door. One cub, smaller than the others, tested its wobbling legs and tottered away from its mother's side. It sniffed at the edge of Michael's coffee table, then clumsily pawed at a forgotten mug. With one determined push, the mug tipped, rolling off the table and clattering onto the floor. Michael flinched at the sound, then burst into a laugh, a real laugh, the kind that came from the belly and startled him with its force. The cub froze at first, then scurried back to its siblings, squeaking triumphantly as if it had meant to cause the chaos all along. From the corner, Sarah let out a low chuckle of her own. She had stayed, though earlier she swore she wouldn't. Her arms were crossed, but her eyes softened as she watched the cub's antics. "Cheeky little bandits," she muttered, shaking her head. "They'll turn your place upside down before the night's through." Michael glanced at her, a smile tugging at his lips. Maybe so. But I'd rather deal with a few mugs than the thought of them freezing to death out there. Sarah didn't argue this time. She only sighed, sinking into one of his old chairs, the weariness in her face easing as she kept her gaze fixed on the fire-lit scene. The cubs were growing bolder by the minute. One pawed at Michael's boot again, tugging at the loose lace as if determined to undo his shoe entirely. Another stumbled toward the hearth, only to be gently pulled back by its mother, who scolded it with a soft growl. The third cub clambered halfway onto Sarah's foot, sniffing at her hem with comical seriousness. Sarah gasped at first, then laughed softly, reaching down with trembling fingers. She didn't quite touch it, but the smile she wore was enough to tell Michael her fears were fading. The mother raccoon lifted her head then, her amber eyes catching the firelight. She regarded Michael for a long moment, her body tense but not hostile. It was a strange look, one that held both caution and acknowledgement. He found himself whispering, "You knew I'd help, didn't you?" She blinked slowly, as though answering. Then she lowered her head again to nuzzle the cub that had nearly frozen on the porch. That cub let out a pitiful but determined squeak, and Michael felt his throat tighten with relief. Hours stretched slowly. The storm outside seemed endless, but the atmosphere within the cabin softened. The scent of burning wood mingled with the faint musk of the animals, not unpleasant but foreign, reminding Michael constantly of how surreal this moment truly was. He moved quietly around the space, adding logs to the fire, fetching an extra blanket to drape nearby. Every time he drew close, the mother raccoon lifted her head, ears twitching, but never once did she bare her teeth. She simply watched, protective yet trusting. By evening, Sarah had pulled her chair closer to the fire, her stern posture long forgotten. "They're not like I imagined," she admitted. "I always thought raccoons were nothing but trouble. But look at them." Michael followed her gaze. The cubs had collapsed into a warm heap, their tiny bodies piled together, their bellies rising and falling in steady rhythm. One twitched in its sleep, letting out a squeaky hiccup that made Sarah laugh so hard she covered her mouth. "Trouble," Michael said quietly, smiling. "But the kind I don't mind." Sarah's eyes glistened in the firelight. She didn't reply. As night deepened, Michael stretched out on the rug across from the Raccoon family. He hadn't planned to stay so close, but somehow it felt wrong to move too far away. His eyes lingered on the mother, who hadn't closed hers once since stepping into the cabin. She stayed curled protectively around her cubs, but every so often her gaze drifted back to him, steady and watchful. There was no aggression in it, only a silent agreement. For this night, they would share this space, bound by something stronger than fear. And as the storm screamed against the cabin, Michael realized he was no longer just sheltering wild creatures. He was part of something rare, something fragile and extraordinary. For the first time in years, he felt the heaviness in his chest ease. Warmth filled the cabin, warmth no blizzard could take away. Morning came slow, as if the storm had stolen time itself. The cabin walls no longer rattled, but the silence outside was heavy, muffled by feet of snow that had buried the yard and road. Michael stirred from his place on the rug, stiff from sleeping so close to the fire. The air was warmer now, thick with the scent of wood smoke, but it wasn't just the fire that had softened the space. It was the presence of the Raccoon family sprawled across the blankets only a few feet away. The 3 cubs were curled together in a tight bundle, their breathing steady, their fur now soft and dry. The smallest one, the one he feared wouldn't make it, let out a soft snore that made Michael grin despite himself. The mother raccoon sat upright beside them, her eyes half closed yet alert, as though she hadn't slept at all. She gave Michael a glance that wasn't hostile, wasn't even cautious anymore, just measured, like a mother deciding how much to trust. Michael stretched and rose to his feet, heading to the kitchen. His boots scuffed against the wood floor, and the sound immediately drew the mother's attention. She stood, ears twitching, watching his every move. He spoke quietly over his shoulder. "Easy. Just breakfast." He rummaged through his pantry and found a small plate of leftover chicken he'd cooked 2 nights before. The meat was cold, but still good. He set it on a plate and crouched low, sliding it across the floor a few feet from the blanket. The mother raccoon tilted her head, sniffed the air, then looked straight at him. The intensity of her stare stopped him cold. It wasn't wild hunger. It was something close to a question, like she was asking permission. Michael sat back on his heels. "Go ahead, it's yours." Slowly, cautiously, she padded forward. She sniffed the chicken, then picked up a piece gently in her teeth and carried it back to her cubs. She tore it into small bites and nudged each one toward their mouths, feeding them before she took a single taste herself. Watching her divide the food so carefully brought a lump to Michael's throat. He had seen that kind of sacrifice before, parents who went hungry so their children could eat, but never from an animal. The cubs ate greedily, squeaking and batting at each other for bigger scraps. One of them, emboldened by the warmth of food and fire, clambered onto Michael's boot. Its tiny claws clutched at the worn leather, and it peered up at him with bright, mischievous eyes. Then, with no warning, it tugged at his bootlace and toppled backward onto its side. Michael laughed out loud, the sound booming in the small cabin. "You're trouble already, aren't you?" Sarah, who had dozed off in his old armchair, stirred at the noise. She blinked, then gasped when she saw the cub sprawled on Michael's foot. "Good Lord, Michael," she whispered. "It's playing with you." He grinned. "Guess I've been adopted." The cub scrambled upright again and toddled towards Sarah's chair. She instinctively pulled her feet up, but the cub only sniffed at the hem of her blanket before curling into a tiny ball on the rug beside her. Sarah stared wide-eyed, then slowly lowered her legs. Her hand trembled as she reached out, stopping just short of touching it. "They don't even seem afraid," she murmured. The mother raccoon watched, her eyes following Sarah's movement. When Sarah pulled her hand back, the raccoon lowered her head again, as if granting approval. For the next hour, the cabin filled with quiet, domestic sounds that felt surreal in their normalcy. The cubs tottered about, pawing at chair legs, climbing halfway up the sofa before tumbling back down. One managed to sneak under the kitchen table, rummaging through an old paper bag until it crinkled so loudly Michael thought it might startle the whole house. Instead, he found himself laughing again, shaking his head. "Little thieves," he said warmly. "Cheeky little thieves." Sarah chuckled softly. "Bandits in masks. You realize they'll have this place torn apart before long." Michael shrugged. "Let them. They've earned it." The mother raccoon eventually gathered them back onto the blanket, nudging them into a pile with soft growls of instruction. They settled reluctantly, their tiny bodies squirming with leftover energy until the warmth of the fire lulled them into sleep again. Michael leaned against the wall, watching the family with a strange ache in his chest. He thought about Sarah's words the night before, about trouble and danger, about what people would say if they knew. But all he could see now was the way the cubs trusted him, the way their mother had chosen his door in the deadliest storm of his life. Sarah's voice broke the silence. "Michael, this isn't just luck. She came to you for a reason." He turned to her, brow furrowing. "What reason?" Sarah met his eyes, her own soft. "Because she knew you wouldn't turn them away." The fire crackled. The snow pressed against the cabin walls. And for the first time in years, Michael felt something close to peace. He didn't know how long this fragile truce would last, but for now, the storm outside could rage all it wanted. Inside, his cabin had become a sanctuary. And though he wouldn't admit it aloud, a part of him hoped the family of raccoons never wanted to leave. The day dragged on in a haze of white. Even when night fell, the storm did not relent. Wind howled like a freight train, snow hammered against the cabin walls, and the windows groaned under the weight pressing against them. Michael checked the door more than once, reassured each time to find it still latched tight, though drifts were already piling halfway up the porch. He had seen plenty of storms in his life, but never one so merciless, never one that seemed determined to erase everything in its path. Inside, the fire glowed steadily, and the raccoon family lay curled in the circle of warmth. The cubs had grown restless as the evening deepened, tumbling over one another, climbing onto the blanket only to tumble back off again. Michael had tried to keep order, chuckling as one of them climbed halfway into his old boot and promptly fell asleep inside. He left it there, unwilling to disturb the tiny body snoring softly against the worn leather. Sarah sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression thoughtful. She had said little since morning, though Michael caught her watching the raccoons with an intensity that betrayed her wonder. Finally, as another gust rattled the chimney, she spoke. "Michael, you know this can't last." He didn't answer right away. He poked at the fire instead, sending sparks into the air. "What do you mean?" "You can't keep them here," Sarah said gently. "They're wild. When the storm ends, they'll have to go back. If anyone in town finds out you sheltered them, they'll think you've lost your mind. Some folks might even call animal control." Michael leaned back on his heels, eyes drifting to the family by the fire. The mother raccoon was awake, grooming one of her cubs with slow, deliberate licks. Every now and then she lifted her gaze to him, amber eyes steady, almost knowing. He swallowed hard. I know what people would say, but I can't just throw them back out there tonight. Not when the storm could kill them in minutes. Sarah exhaled, the sound heavy with concern. You're taking on more than you realize. He gave a humorless smile. That's nothing new. The cub in his boot stirred, squeaked, and peeked its masked face out with a mischievous blink. Michael reached down and stroked the rim of the boot gently. You picked the warmest spot in the house, didn't you? He murmured. The cub yawned wide, then retreated back inside, leaving Sarah shaking her head. You're already attached, she said softly. That's what scares me. Michael looked at her sharply. Attached? These are lives, Sarah. 3 little lives and their mother. If being attached is what it takes to keep them alive, then so be it. The fire snapped loudly, and silence stretched between them. The truth was, Sarah wasn't wrong. Michael already felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Every time one of the cubs whimpered, every time the mother glanced at him for reassurance, he felt it deeper. It was the same feeling he'd had pulling strangers out of burning houses, the knowledge that, for this moment at least, their survival rested in his hands. Hours passed. The storm showed no sign of breaking. The mother raccoon finally lay down with her cubs, their small bodies pressed tightly against her chest. Michael lay back on the rug, staring at the ceiling beams as the wind screamed outside. He tried to close his eyes, but the gnawing thought returned again and again. What would happen when this was over? Sarah's words circled in his mind. Animal control, town gossip, the impossibility of keeping wild creatures inside a man's home. He had no answers, and yet the idea of driving them away made his chest ache. At some point after midnight, the cabin shifted into an uneasy peace. Sarah dozed again in the chair, her chin tucked to her chest. The firelight danced shadows across the floorboards, across the raccoons, huddled in sleep. Michael thought he might finally drift off when he felt a brush against his arm. He opened his eyes to find the mother raccoon standing beside him. She hadn't made a sound, hadn't startled him awake. She simply stood there, her head lowered, her paw resting lightly against his sleeve. For a long moment she held his gaze, her eyes bright in the firelight. Then, as silently as she had come, she returned to her cubs. Michael lay there staring at the ceiling, heart pounding, unable to shake the meaning of that simple gesture. It was no longer just survival that bound them. It was trust, and that trust carried with it a responsibility heavier than any he had borne in years. He closed his eyes again, listening to the wind batter the walls, and he knew with bone-deep certainty that when the storm finally broke, nothing in his life would be the same. By morning, the storm had finally broken. The silence was so complete that Michael thought at first his ears had stopped working. He opened the cabin door just a crack, wincing at the blast of cold air that rushed in. The yard lay buried beneath a world of white. Snowdrifts rose higher than the porch railing, smoothing every shape and shadow until the landscape looked like some alien planet. The air was sharp, still dangerous, but it no longer roared with the fury of the night before. Behind him, the raccoon family stirred. The cubs blinked against the thin shaft of daylight sneaking through the door, their black-ringed eyes curious, their little bodies wiggling with a new restlessness. They were stronger now, their fur dry, their tiny bellies round from food and warmth. The smallest one, the one Michael had feared he would lose, clambered unsteadily over its siblings and gave a squeak so confident it made him grin. The mother raccoon stood slowly, stretching her legs before padding toward the door. She paused beside her cubs, giving them each a gentle nudge with her nose, urging them awake. They chirped and tumbled, but she was insistent. It was time. Michael's throat tightened as he realized what she meant to do. He had known this moment was coming, yet it felt too soon. The storm had brought them together, had bound his life to theirs in a way he couldn't explain. Now the storm was over, and so was the fragile truce. Sarah, still sitting in the chair near the fire, stirred and stood, pulling her coat tighter. She stepped beside him at the door, her eyes soft with understanding. "She's leaving," she whispered. Michael nodded, though he didn't trust his voice. The first cub toddled toward the door, sniffing the edge of the threshold before plunging its tiny paws into the snow. It squeaked in protest at the cold, then scurried back to its mother, who nudged it forward again with infinite patience. One by one, the others followed, their tracks marking tiny trails in the endless white. Then, the mother hesitated. She turned back to Michael, her amber eyes locking onto his. For a long breath, the world seemed to stop. She padded forward, closing the distance between them, until she stood just inches from where he knelt at the doorframe. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted one paw and pressed it against his arm. The touch was light, fleeting, yet powerful enough to pierce straight through him. Michael felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to say something, to promise her safety, to thank her for the trust she had given him. But words felt clumsy, too small for the moment. He only nodded, his eyes stinging with unspoken emotion. She withdrew her paw, turned, and slipped into the snow, her cubs scurrying after her. Their dark shapes grew smaller against the white landscape, their tails flicking as they wove between drifts. Within moments they were only shadows, then nothing at all, swallowed by the forest beyond. The silence that followed was heavy, yet not empty. The cabin still glowed with the warmth of the fire, but it seemed changed, as though it carried echoes of tiny paws, squeaks, and soft eyes that had trusted him when they had nowhere else to turn. Sarah laid a hand on his shoulder. Her voice was low, steady. "Michael, what you just lived through, most people wouldn't believe. But I saw it, and I'll never forget it." He swallowed hard, unable to answer. His gaze lingered on the place where the Raccoon family had vanished, the untouched snow already beginning to erase their tracks. As he closed the door against the lingering cold, Michael felt both the ache of loss and the fullness of gratitude. He had sheltered a family that should never have trusted him, and yet they had. They had let him witness something wild, something pure, something that blurred the line between man and nature. He turned back to the quiet cabin, to the scattered boot where a cub had slept, to the coffee mug still lying on its side from days ago. And for the first time in years, he felt his heart lighter, steadier. The storm had tested him, but it had also given him a gift he hadn't known he needed, a reminder that even in the harshest cold, warmth could be found in the most unexpected places. Michael set another log on the fire and sat down, staring into the flames. Somewhere out there, beneath the endless snow and the frozen trees, a family of raccoons was alive because he had opened his door. And that was enough. If this story touched your heart, leave a simple comment. Just a 0 or a 1 is enough to let me know you were here. Your words mean more than you think. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might be even more unforgettable. Stay with us. You won't want to miss what comes next.